Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, has the Honourable the Premier received any assurances from British Columbia Premier John Horgan that he will stop the policy of his government to do everything possible to prevent the construction of the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've not had any direct conversations. I can say that just today, the Premier of British Columbia was quoted as saying that, in fact, what they are now doing is doing everything possible to protect the coast, and that they have officially switched from it being focused on everything possible to stop the pipeline. So that was in today's press conference. That being said, though, Mr. Speaker, I think the real key issue here is that through the federal decision to purchase, that the issue of Crown immunity changes the situation and provides more certainty than we had before, Mr. Speaker.
First supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier just said that it provides greater certainty. Could the Honourable the Premier please identify a single environmental organization, municipal government, First Nation, a provincial government that has indicated, as a result of today's announcement, that they support and will stop efforts to obstruct the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion?
Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can say again is that what we know is that the concern about investor uncertainty has been eliminated because the investor that is currently in play is absolutely committed to getting the pipeline built. In addition, through Crown ownership, there's a legal principle of Crown immunity that actually further strengthens the role of the federal government from a legal perspective as it relates to complaints that might be raised by some of the organizations outlined, although not the Indigenous groups, where we were all very committed to continuing to work with them respectfully, Mr. Speaker.
Second supplemental.
Mr. Speaker, accepting the Premier's claim that federal ownership will clarify federal jurisdiction, why does the Premier then support the undertaking of the federal government to sell its interest as soon as possible to private sector shareholders?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, in fact, we will keep a watchful eye on that matter, Mr. Speaker, but I do know that even as the federal government is looking at that option, they are looking at doing it in a way that pairs that option with the kind of additional legal certainty that I was just referring to in answer to the last question, Mr. Speaker. So we will be sure that that certainty remains. That's one of the principles that we outlined on April 8th. That's one of the principles that we were very happy to deliver today, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of Albertans, for working Albertans to build this province and this country, Mr. Speaker.
Yes. Second main question.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the Premier has said that the decision by Kinder Morgan to withdraw its planned pipeline expansion project increases certainty. The Canadian Energy Pipeline Association instead has said that they are concerned about the implications of the government's financial intervention for future transmission pipeline projects. Many other leaders and associations in the energy industry have echoed the same concern, that in fact today's developments do not increase but rather undermine investor confidence in Canada's energy sector. Does the Premier believe that CEPA and other industry groups are wrong?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've actually heard from a number of people in the energy sector today that this is good news, and that this actually increases certainty and it does not undermine it. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Trans Mountain pipeline, when it is completed, will be the first direct pipeline constructed to tidewater since the 1950s, Mr. Speaker. Every now and then it becomes necessary for the public sector and government to be involved in nation building. That's what many people actually elect their governments to do, Mr. Speaker. We are proud to be part of it, Mr. Speaker. Walking away, tying our hands and pretending that we have no role to play, that's how you have failure.
Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have failure because the federal government cancelled the Northern Gateway pipeline, killed Energy East, surrendered to the American initial veto on Keystone XL, and has still done nothing to exert pressure on the government of British Columbia to ensure the construction of the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, regardless of who happens to own it. So will the Premier agree with me that the federal government must exert pressure on the NDP government of Victoria to stop its policy of obstruction and of death by delay.
The Honourable Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite started his question by saying what we have today is failure. I tell you, he is like the person who shows up at a dinner party empty-handed, complaining about the food and the color of the cocktail napkins, Mr. Speaker. I swear to God, this deal puts people to work, it unlocks investment, it helps us build schools, hospitals and roads, it gets us to Tidewater, Mr. Speaker. It is exactly what we said we would do, Mr. Speaker, and it is exactly the thing that Albertans wanted to see their government work on, and that's what we've done.
The Honourable Member.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, this is a Premier who seems to have celebrated a policy that's led us to every private sector investor trying to build a coastal pipeline withdrawing or having been vetoed. Mr. Speaker, if this seems to be the NDP's definition of success, being backed into a corner and forcing taxpayers to pick up the tab. Now, Mr. Speaker, the question is, given that Premier Horgan has tripled down today on his threat to do everything possible to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline, will the Alberta government use Bill 12 to exert pressure on the BC government to ensure construction of the pipeline?
Thank you. The Honourable Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, in fact, that's not exactly what happened in BC today, so first of all, that's not true. Mr. Speaker, what we will do is we will continue to work strategically and effectively to get this job done. Today was a major, major step forward. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, that if someone else had been in charge and we'd adopted their path of first having temper tantrums at everyone who disagreed with us, and then secondly, hurling gratuitous insults at the federal government just cause, you know what would happen? We wouldn't have this today. We wouldn't have a pipeline. It'd be a repeat of the previous 9 years when the member opposite was in the federal government.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Third main question.
Well, we do know what did happen, Mr. Speaker. We had a provincial government that signalled to Prime Minister Trudeau that he could go ahead and cancel Northern Gateway with the agreement of Alberta, that he could effectively kill Energy East with no protest from the Alberta government, that he could refuse to apply any meaningful fiscal or political pressure on the government of British Columbia without any meaningful complaint from this government. So, Mr. Speaker, the question is simply this. Will this government indicate to Premier Horgan that if his obstruction continues, there will be consequences?
The Honourable Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I know the member opposite likes to grab a narrative and then just hold on to it without a particular regard for the facts, but I'd like to remind the members of this Assembly that the Northern Gateway pipeline went down because the federal court looked at the record of the previous Conservative federal government and said that their failure to consult with Indigenous people was an abject failure and that was why the pipeline could not go ahead, Mr. Speaker. So we really must clarify the record. Our government's taking a different approach. We are talking with Indigenous people. We are working with all our partners, and we will get the job done.
First supplemental.
The Premier is rewriting the historical record, Mr. Speaker. The court asked the federal crown... Sir, Mr. Speaker, are you going to stop the heckling here?
Honourable Member, I will address at what point I wish to interlude rather than any member of the House. Please proceed.
Sure. Mr. Speaker, the federal court asked for additional consultation. Enbridge continued with the plan to proceed with Northern Gateway, and it was the Justin Trudeau government that vetoed it and is now hammering the nail into the coffin of those exports with Bill C-48, the tanker traffic ban, and Bill C-69 that will make it very difficult to get a future pipeline built. Will the Premier agree with me that these bills are unhelpful to the prospects of future market access for Canadian energy?
Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, what I will agree is unhelpful, Mr. Speaker, is having someone in this province who claims to be on side with Albertans in the task that we all believe in, which is getting this pipeline built, but at the same time signals to investors, signals to the opposition, works with the opposition, dines out on the opposition to the pipeline in order to serve his own political interests, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is that today we took a very important step forward. And what we should be doing is celebrating that fact and continuing to work together rather than cheering for the failure of Alberta's working people.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't appoint Sephora Bourbon to the Oil Sands Advisory Committee. I didn't appoint Karen Mon to the Oil Sands Advisory Committee, people who are calling for the total elimination of this industry. Mr. Speaker, I don't belong to a federal party that's calling for the shutdown of Alberta's energy industry. But, Mr. Speaker, the question was simply this. Does the Premier agree with me that in order we should continue to pursue other potential export possibilities by encouraging the federal government to suspend Bill C-69 and Bill C-48 to create greater certainty for other prospective pipeline projects in the future?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. No, it's interesting. The member opposite actually belongs to a federal party that, while is right now saying it doesn't think that the federal government should be putting any money towards supporting Alberta's energy industry, when it was in office, it put $9 billion towards supporting Ontario's auto industry. You know what, Mr. Speaker? The member opposite says he stands for Albertans, but I think that guarantee's a little bit like his grassroots guarantee. Here today, gone tomorrow, but maybe it's just an IT problem, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Calgary Southeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The federal government